Hello everyone, this is Lee. What if I told you Buddha nearly starved himself to death before realizing that was the wrong path to enlightenment? In this video, I will tell you how a once sheltered prince turned into one of the most celebrated philosophers in human history, and why his story is much more human and much less religious than people may think. I also strongly invite you to question the insights and information I provide within this video, because that's what Buddha would have wanted. He always encouraged his followers and his students to question his teachings. Gautama, later known as the Buddha, was born a prince from a small nation in ancient India around the 5th to the 6th BC. The legend says that when he was born, his father, the king, was visited by a wise man who predicted that this baby would grow up to become either the king of the world or the spiritual leader of the world. His father was thrilled, also a little worried, as no king would want their son to become a spiritual leader. So the king decided to put his son in a bubble, a golden palace filled with the most luxuries. Only the healthy, the young, and the obedient servants were allowed to access this heaven on earth, as an attempt to make him fall in love with power, luxuries, and pleasures. Any sign of decay and degeneration were carefully kept away from the prince. The prince basically grew up inside a never-ending party, filled with all the pleasures a man could ever possibly imagine: dance, music, food, wine, and of course all the physical pleasures. The prince was completely sheltered away from the tragic truths of the world. What happens when you put a normal-minded kid in a closed environment and protecting him from ever going out? It's the story of Adam and Eve all over again. When you tell them don't do a thing, they do the thing. So of course, like any normal-minded kid with overprotective parents, he ran away. Not once, not twice, not thrice, but thrice? You get my point. He tried to run away 4 times in total. The first time, his father actually sent an army to clean up the streets and got rid of all the old, sick, and ugly people. The path was covered with flowers, the street was filled with the fairest woman of the kingdom, and everyone looked happy, as the king's plan was to duplicate the outside world's experience to exactly resemble the life the prince had grown up with. But similar to the story of Adam and Eve, this plan was too disrupted. The king's army ended up forgetting one old man left on the street appeared right in front of the prince. The prince, fascinated by the old man as he was the only thing who looked different from the rest, asked his servant, "What is this crumbling, bent, and broken creature besides my retinue?" And the servant answered, "This is a man like other men who was born an infant, became a child, a youth, a husband, a father of fathers. He has become old, subject to the destruction of his strength, of his beauty, his will, and the possibilities of life." "Like other men, you say?" the prince asked hesitantly. "That means this will happen to me?" And the servant answered, "Inevitably, with the passage of time." The world collapsed around the prince, and he asked to be returned to the safety of his palace. Not so long after he recovered from the PTSD of seeing the old man and learned the concept of aging, he decided to go out again, and this time he saw a sick man in full view. "This creature," he asked his servant, shaking and palsied, horribly afflicted, unbearable to behold, a source of pity and contempt, "what is he?" And the servant answered, "This is a man, like other men, who was born whole, but who became ill and sick, unable to cope, a burden to himself and others, suffering and incurable." "Like other men, you say?" inquired by the prince. "This could happen to me?" And the servant answered, "No man is exempt from the ravages of disease." The world collapsed once again, and the prince was once again returned to his palace, this time with the newly acquired knowledge of sickness. He recovered for a while and decided to go out again for the 3rd time. This time he saw a dead man. "This thing," he asked his servant, lying still, appearing so fearsome, surrounded by grief and sorrow, lost and forlorn, "what is it?" And the servant answered, "This is a man, Like other man, born of woman, beloved and hated, who once was you and now is the earth. Like other men, you say, inquired the prince. Then this could happen to me. This is your end, said the servant, and the end of all men. The world collapsed for the final time, and he asked to be returned home, with the freshly acquired desperate awareness of death. But the servant had orders from the king and took him instead to a festival of women, occurring nearby. The prince was met by a beautiful assemblage of women, who offered themselves freely to him, without restraint, in song, in dance, in play, in the spirit of sensual love. But the prince could only think of death and the inevitable decomposition of the beauty that is dancing before him, and took no pleasure. Finally, for the last time, he ran away with all of his earthly possessions left behind, power, luxuries, family, to seek the truth, salvation, and enlightenment. For that golden palace of his was nothing but illusions that's destined to be destroyed. And he wasn't wrong. Not long after his departure, the nation he left behind was conquered and enslaved by another, and he was the only royal blood who survived. Gautama now became a dedicated apprentice and the most disciplined practitioner of tapas, meaning heat or austerity, a method devoted to voluntary tortures. People who practice tapas believe that self-inflicted suffering, severe, intentional, and prolonged, can burn away the impurities of the body, and it's been said by many that this method can lead to spiritual awakening and ultimately liberation from the circle of reincarnation. I personally, however, highly suspect that what they're really experiencing is a high, maybe even an addiction, not necessarily to the pain itself, but to the dopamine relief that comes after surviving their own self-inflicted tortures. Anyone who has done a prolonged fast before, maybe it's 2 days, sometimes 3 days, maybe even up to a week, knows this feeling. The first bite of food after days without eating doesn't just taste good. It feels like heaven itself. The body celebrates, the mind lights up euphorically. So there are some good reasons why this method is so popular even in today's world. Following his predecessors, Gautama too put himself through these tortures, such as standing motionlessly under the burning sun for days, going without sleep as much as possible, or exposing his body to burning fire and raging rivers. He even went to the forest without clothes on for days, practically offering himself to the wild animals to feast on. But no matter how much suffering he endured, he didn't seem to come even a step closer to the spiritual awakening he was promised. It seemed that denying life itself through extreme physical and mental hardship did not make life better. So what was his final attempt? He decided to stop eating. He began by gradually reducing his food intake for nearly 6 years. At the end of this period, he was eating as little as 1 grain of rice a day. He became so weak that, according to the scriptures, his bones could be seen through his skin and his veins crawled across his body like the roots of a tree. He pushed his body to the absolute brink of death. Then one day, while attempting to bathe in a river, he collapsed. Unconscious, his body was carried by the current and eventually washed ashore. And there he was saved by a young woman. He was awakened by the smell of payasam, I hope I didn't pronounce that wrong, a sweet rice pudding made with milk and sugar, which was offered to him by the young woman. In some scriptures, this young lady is honored as the mother of Buddha, because it was her who has given him the second life. Now, what happens again to the human body after it breaks a prolonged fast that's longer than just a few days? The body produces a euphoric amount of dopamine. In Buddha's case, his fasting was lasted for 6 whole years, so one could only imagine the overwhelming chemical relief he had experienced, which might very well have been the spiritual awakening so long preached by his fellow practitioners. But Gautama arrived to a completely different conclusion. That is, the whole idea of you must torture yourself unnecessarily to obtain a better life was wrong. It is a scam. And that's when Gautama finally came to a certain settlement with his philosophical struggles. his fear of death, his wrestling with human mortality. Revolutionarily, he denounced the practice of enduring unnecessary suffering as insufficient for spiritual enlightenment, a path he had once been the most faithful apprentice of. And ironically, that's how he achieved his spiritual awakening, only after spending so much time and efforts on the wrong path. I'm not encouraging anyone to torture themselves by any means, but it is very interesting to think about that, how sometimes we can only do something right after trying everything wrong. From that moment, Gautama was crowned as the Buddha. In Sanskrit, it means the awakened one, someone who has achieved a certain level of peacefulness within and knows clearly of what their purpose is in this life. That's all the word means. It doesn't equal to God, nor does it have any special powers to it. Buddha never claimed to be a god or have any special connections with the heaven or any spirits. He also ate meat, and he has never restricted any of his followers from eating meat. The whole monks shouldn't be eating meat thing originally came from a Chinese emperor. That's why when you visit different temples in different countries, they often have different rules regarding meat eating, because most of those countries learned Buddhism from China instead of India, but some were before the emperor and some were after. So when you see people worshipping Buddha as a literal god or going vegan blindly without a good understanding of nutrition, they're definitely far off from what Buddha originally stood for. It's also worth mentioning that becoming enlightened, at least according to Buddha himself, didn't make him all-knowing. Buddha, too, had philosophical struggles and questions that he couldn't answer. And even for the great questions he had answers of, he still strongly encouraged his students to question his teachings. With that spirit in mind, let's finish this video with the most principal teachings of Buddha. So what are the most principal teachings of Buddha in relation to the subject of suffering? Rather than explaining them separately, I'm going to explain them as a step-by-step guide as to reducing suffering in life in a practical manner. Step 1 is dukkha, acknowledging that life involves suffering. It doesn't equal to life is suffering, which is one of the most popular mistranslations. Life isn't all bad and evil, because if it were, it would be universally undesirable. It's precisely the good parts of life that keeps us reproducing. By realizing that there are both inherent goodness and unavoidable suffering in this world, we can begin to appreciate life more by consciously reducing the unnecessary and avoidable parts of suffering. Step 2 is samadheya, identifying the cause of unnecessary suffering. Buddha points out that the root of suffering lies in the desires that involved greed, ignorance, and hatred. This doesn't refer to only the desire for wealth or sexual pleasures, but also unrealistic and unachievable desires, such as trying to chase too many things at once, or wanting to change other people's actions or ideas, which, principally speaking, is impossible. Step 3 is nirodha, to identify and eliminate unrealistic and unachievable desires in life in order to attain a sense of freedom. This does not mean eliminating all desires, because that's an equivalent of denying life itself and all the goodness within. Step 4 is magga, elimination of unnecessary suffering. To do that, one must practice the Noble Eightfold Path. That's developing the right understanding of the world, having positive intentions, practice the right speech, practice the right conduct, choosing the right perfection, cultivate the right efforts, paying attention to the right things, such as the present moment, or observing thoughts and feelings carefully without unhelpful judgments. And lastly, meditations on the right subjects, the concentration of the right details, meaning one should spend the appropriate amount of focus, sometimes more, sometimes less, sometimes none, on the correct subjects for mental clarity. These fundamental teachings of Buddhism, in my opinion, is much more practical and much less authoritative than most other religions. Buddhism didn't really start as a religion. Similar to Stoicism, it's more like a way of life for us to live up to. And Stoicism, by the way, is being promoted and practiced as a religion these days by some people, which is interesting to think about. A lot of Buddha's teaching are focused on limiting the number of your desires. For anyone who wants to achieve something amazing in life, the biggest problem that they may encounter these days is the problem of spared attentions on multiple different subjects. And for that, I have a digital product available in description. I designed this 100 days digital planner with the idea of limiting one's focus and efforts each day to the right subjects. It also comes with a small gift, which if you have some free time after a very focused day, you may find it culturally refreshing. It's the best way to help this channel more than you already have, of course, by watching, liking, and subscribing. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again very soon in the next video.